Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here again. Thank you very much for the introduction. Again, I've been here last, I think it was a couple months ago, so it's a pleasure to be again here. And tonight's topic, it's part of a three-part series. Each one is independent, so if you don't like it, you don't have to come to the rest. It won't be a waste of your time. And the concept is about the history of development of science. So, as you'll see, this is the morale of Prague and the Jewish attitude towards scientific development. We are going to start at a point in time, and we're going to go back in history to see how history developed. Now, we all know that science was developed in the beginning of the millennium, a lot of the science, and it stayed stagnant up to the development of something called the early modern science. Do you know when the early modern period starts from? Meaning, what is the benchmark? What is the demarcation to the beginning of what's called modern science? Does anybody know what period and what discovery was it? Guesses? Huh?
Newton?
No, Newton is the end of the scientific revolution. We are now going to the beginning of the early science period, which is called the scientific revolution. Yes? Copernicus. Excellent. So Copernicus is the beginning of the scientific revolution. And by the way, funny enough, the book which created this scientific revolution, you know the name of the book was called Revolutions. But nothing to do with the revolution that we take as revolution. Revolution was the revolving of the planets and the stars. Okay? So we are going to go to the beginning of early modern science, the beginning of the scientific revolution. The scientific revolution, according to most scholars, starts with Copernicus in the 16th century, 15th century really, and it ends with Newton in the 18th century. And this is the topic of tonight. This January 6th, we're going to go to the part of science, which is from Newton to relativity, which is the part of Darwin, when Darwin comes into the picture. And then the third part will be the schools of quantum, of relativity, and of string theory, which are called the postmodern theories. Okay? So this is the scientific revolution. Now, what did the world believe? All the scientific discoveries were made at the beginning of the millennium, and what was the best and the most important book that was, or the author of science at that time was? Huh?
The Bible?
No. Great, good guess, but it's not. No, it was Aristotle. Aristotle, with his philosophy, was called Philosophia Naturalis, the natural philosophy, and he had all these ideas about the universe. But you know what's amazing about the ideas of Aristotle? Those ideas were never tested. There was nothing to see, nothing to prove. There were nothing but speculations. And the universe, according to Aristotle and according to the simple reading of the Bible, the world, the universe was something called geocentric. Does anybody know what geocentric is? Earth. The earth was the center of the universe, and the earth was static. Now, this is what the Bible in its simple meaning says, and that's what Aristotle always believed. The earth is the center, the human being is the center of the universe, everything revolves around it. Now, the problem is, in astronomy, it does not work very easy to believe such a thing. You know why? Because of the revolving of the planets. The planets, on planet Earth, you could see the planets. If anybody ever go to the sky outside, you have very bright stars. But if you're careful enough, you realize that the very bright stars are not really stars. They are the planets. It's Venus and Mars and etc. And if you go ahead and you map out, at that time they didn't have the telescope. We're going to get to the telescope tonight. But this is way before the telescope. But people mapped out the stars, those planets, as they moved in the firmament. And therefore, it was impossible to go ahead and to assume the world was geocentric. It just did not work. So the famous work of astronomy of 2nd century of the Common Era that this becomes the greatest work, and it's called the Almagest. Does anybody know which work am I talking about? Guess? It's the work of Ptolemy. Ptolemaic astronomy is the astronomy that dictates how we are going to measure the movement of the planets, given everything that we know, that the world is geocentric, the universe, and all the rules of Aristotle in his work. Okay, this is called the Almagest, the great work. Now for it, it's probably, guys, one of the most creative works out there, because basically to fit a square peg in a round hole, it's pretty tough. To come up with the idea that the world is really static, is a geocentric world, really doesn't fit. So he created three things. I'm going to mention to you, just good for you to know. He created the eccentric, and he was really, I think, eccentric. The is called the epicloe. The epicloe is one kind of a constant that you had to play with in the equant. Those are three ways of calculating orbits to allow for a geocentric world. But it was the most complicated, unelegant system that existed. And that lasted for over 1,000 years. Until somebody called Copernicus created something called, the book called Revolutions. If you look at this first page, this is a copy of Revolutions. Now this is the beginning of the scientific revolution. I tell you, it's such interesting that he called this book Revolutions. And what he did was, you know something, why do we go to these epicals and this all kind of crazy computations that never work? That the universe has all these crazy constants to allow for the movement of the balance. Let's change the equation. And let's say, you know something, it's not geocentric, it's heliocentric. Does anybody know what heliocentric means? Sun centers. And this is what he writes. See? This picture is worth 1,000 words. And you'll see, so he did it. This is the sun, and all the planets go around it. So heliocentric, the Earth is not the center of the universe. The Earth is not static. Now, when he published it, you know, it's very funny. You know who wrote, in Hebrew, in Jewish books, when you publish a book, you get something called a haskama, an approbation. The Christians and this church had at that time approbations also. You had to get an approbation before you wrote a book. You know who wrote the approbation to Copernicus? The church itself. So imagine, the church itself, the approbation, is one of the priests of the church wrote in the 16th century. Not even realizing that he was going to create the biggest havoc that ever happened in the planet for that time. But he wrote and he said, you know something? It's cute. It really works. And that's what he writes. It's an elegant way of explaining the universe. So this is Revolutions. Now, as Thomas Kuhn is a great book. If anybody ever wants to read a book that will challenge your mind, it's a very short book. And I think it's one book that will inform you for the rest of your life. It's by Thomas Kuhn, called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Have anybody ever read the book? Anybody? Okay, so now you have, if you have any time, it's a short book, but probably one of the most challenging books you ever read in your life, because it'll help you everything. It's called Thomas Kuhn. He is the famous philosopher of science. And you know what he says? When you go ahead and you change something very dramatic, it's called a paradigm shift. But people don't realize that a revolution is taking place until much later. Things move a little bit and you think that every world is the same until one day you realize that, wow, the world just changed into us. The ultimate example of that structure of scientific revolution is Copernicus. Copernicus changed the whole thing. But people didn't realize. People thought, you know, something's cute, okay? So what? Geocentric, heliocentric, what difference does it make? But people didn't realize that much later this will cause a great revolution. Okay. This idea of Copernicus was taken somewhat seriously, but the world still believed that the world is geocentric and everything changed, life continues. You don't realize that the world has changed on you until much later. Now this is the 15th century. Now let's forward to the 16th century. In the 16th century, there was a great astronomer who decided to take Copernicus seriously. His name was Tycho Brahe. Has anybody heard of Tycho Brahe? Those names you have to remember. Tycho Brahe was a great astronomer who lived in Denmark. He created the coolest observatory probably ever, called the Uraniborg. Uraniborg was the king of Denmark, had enough money, so he built a whole city in the palace. And they had this, so imagine it was an observatory, but you know what was missing from the observatory? Mid-16th century, what was missing? There was no telescope. So here's an observatory without a telescope. So you could imagine, how do you observe without a telescope? So he created the coolest instruments to measure. What he was trying to do is to measure the movement of the planets and the shadows of the light just from the naked eye. And he made great discoveries, this guy Tycho Brahe. Okay, so we're going to see it. Don't have to memorize all the names if you don't want. If you do, you could. No, sorry. I have to memorize how to use the remote control. So he created a book, and this is how he says. He says, you know something? He makes two observations he makes. The first observation was the comet of Tycho Brahe. Tycho Brahe says, you know something? You know one of Aristotle's ideas, the earth, you remember Aristotle, the earth is static. The earth is the center of the universe. But you know what else he said? Like part of today we look at it, it's looking funny. That the universe, the sky heavens is perfect. So there's no movement in heaven. Any movement has to be what? Sublunar. You know what sublunar means? Does anybody know what sublunar means? Huh? Below the moon. Can never have, nothing above the moon can move. So you know what Tycho Brahe said? You know something? He said he sees one night that there is a star that's moving very fast. And he realizes it's not a star. What is it? A comet. So he says, I'm going to measure the parallax. The parallax means the change of the brightness of the light to see how far it is in comparing to the light of the moon. And he comes out to the conclusion that, you know something? This comet is above the moon. How can you have a comet above the moon, according to Aristotle? According to Aristotle, above the moon, there is no movement. So that already made him very strange. The next thing is Mars. He wanted to know if Mars, once he started measuring the parallax, this idea of the brightness of the light, he wanted to know if Mars gets closer to Earth than the sun. Because according to Ptolemy, to those crazy equations, that could never happen. And you know what he found out? That it does get closer. So he realizes, you know something? This Aristotle stuff, it's all BS. It doesn't work. If you pay attention enough, people have been believing this from the 2nd century to the 16th century, 1400 years, but it just doesn't work. But he realized that this is going to cause a great revolution. Because if people are going to pay attention, it means that the whole Bible, according to him, was wrong. Because the Bible, the literal reading of the Bible, is that the earth is the center of the earth. That the earth is static, and this heavens were perfect. There was no movement. So he decided to say, you know something? He was an ultimate diplomat. I told you, he built a huge fortune for himself. So he said, you know something? Aristotle doesn't work. So you know something? Let's create some kind of a compromise. We're going to create a system that everything revolves around the sun, but the sun revolves around the earth. Like, this is the other compromise. So you're right, the world is heliocentric, but we put a caveat that the sun revolves around the earth. And this is this crazy system here, you see? Everything around moves, and everything moves around the earth. The sun, this is the sun with all of the planets around. So the sun moves around the earth. And this guy makes it. This is the only compromise. And that's why he saved his own skin. But he says, people, Copernicus is going to change everything we know about life. This is going to really change. So therefore, let me give you a way how to navigate the Bible and our belief system for so long. That was Tycho Brahe. But you know what happened to Tycho Brahe? I told you he was an ultimate diplomat. So he decided to move Venus. And he decided to move at the end of his life from Denmark to where? Anybody who was in our trip to Prague, where did he move to? He went to Prague, to the court of Rudolf II, the Holy Roman Emperor. Rudolf II is the most, again, if you want to see a biography of somebody, very, very interesting is Rudolf II. Rudolf II spent all the money of the empire to find the most interesting and the most attractive things in the world. And that's Rudolf II. So he invites Tycho Brahe. He says, you know something, you built Uraniborg in Denmark. I'll build you a nicer palace with a nicer observatory that you'll be able to continue to do your stuff here in Prague. And he moves. You'll see that he was there, I think, only for 1 year only. And somebody else comes to replace him, his disciple. His name was Johann Kepler. Have anybody heard of Johann Kepler and the Kepler laws of the universe? Right? Johann Kepler moves into Prague. Now, let's look at a few pictures. It's always good. A picture is worth 1,000 words. So let's go see here. This is a picture. This picture on top is Tycho Brahe. He looked like a very nice and noble gentleman. And this is Johannes Kepler in 1610. There were all of them, they became very much Copernicus's followers. But they decided to create and to navigate this thing into some kind of a compromise. Now, just one more set of pictures. And this is Rudolf II, okay, this king. If anybody has seen his picture, there was a picture of his that he commissioned that his portrait is made out of fruits, of all tropical fruits. He was a crazy guy. He had the closets of curiosities, because at that time, you realize that the Americas had been discovered, all these new continents, and they just collected stuff. They brought stuff from India, and they had closets of curiosities. And people had parrots out of Peru, and they had all kinds of crazy things, and he spent all his money doing this. So this is this guy who decided, but he was the patron of the arts and the patron of the sciences. And if you want to see a little bit more, this is anybody who went with us to Prague, and I encourage everybody to visit Prague. There is an actual observatory in the same model. It's not the original observatory, but it's a copy made by the Jesuits. And this is the sextant. You see, this is a depiction of this is Tycho Brahe. 3 floors. His observatory was a multi-tower of different people. Different people worked in different floors. And this is the sextant. The sextant was this idea of measuring the location of the planets, because that's how you got to know. You couldn't see anything else. So you look at the firmament, in a place which was clear, there was no pollution at the time, so there's no need for Copenhagen and for the greenhouse effect. So there's no pollution at the time. So you could see the skies very clearly, and that's how he did, and he measured the movement of the planets and the movement of the comets, and that's it. Okay? Now, everybody knows that following Tycho Brahe, there was somebody in Italy, also commissioned by the clergy and then by the nobility, to be an astronomer. His name was Galileo Galilei. And you know what he discovered, what he created? He created the laws of motion. Everybody knows he was a great, great inventor, and he created a telescope. And the first thing he looks is, what's the closest thing in the heavens, or the firmament's closest to Earth? The moon. And looking at the moon, again, he sees that Aristotle was BS. You know why? What I told you about Aristotle, the rule of Aristotle, that everything in heaven is perfect. When he saw the craters on the moon is not perfect. It's not a perfect circle. There are all kinds of craters in the moon. So that violates Aristotle's law number 101. So the first thing he sees, wow, this thing doesn't make any sense. And then he goes to prove with a telescope that Copernicus is right. But he wasn't such a diplomat like everybody else. And he decided to, you know something? He was a religious man. He sees the Bible. He says the Bible says one thing, and he sees something totally different out there. So he decided to show that contradiction, and he comes with the famous theory of the 2 books. Does anybody know what are the two books of Galileo that he gets into trouble because of the two books? The book of nature and the book of the Bible. Both written by God. So he says it can't be that those contradict. There must be a way of reconciling the two. But you just can't take Aristotle as the book of the nature because that doesn't fit what I see. And if you see the next page, we're going to read together what did the church do with him. And everybody who sees there's enough movies on this stuff. The Illuminati, everybody knows the Illuminati probably by now, right? Dan Brown, who are the Illuminati? Does anybody know who the Illuminati are? Huh? Please? The protectors of the church. There was the people, and these are the guys who the story of Galileo become a legend in the church. Okay, Christian opinion, March 1606, okay? Let's look at about anybody who has the handout. Seeing that he has come to us the notice of the general congregation of the index, the Pythagorean doctrine, which is false, entirely opposed to the Holy Scriptures, the movement of the earth, and he brings down now the book by Copernicus, De Revolutionibus, in a thing. In order that the opinion should not be further propagated, the decrement of the church is decreed that said work should be suspended until it's corrected. So the church prohibits Copernicus, and it prohibits and it forces Galileo to retract all he said. And that all similar works, like Copernicus, which contain these teachings, so be prohibited. This present decree prohibiting, condemning, and suspending all of them respectively. See, the church, we didn't have to answer, we just banned the book. You know how this place was called, meaning where was this published? This was published in the famous index of the church. Does anybody know what the index was? It was an index of books that you couldn't read or prohibited. Probably the most popular books out there. But at that time, if you got caught with one of the books of the index, you got burned alive. So you didn't get a fine, there was no due process. You got into the books of the index and you're in trouble. In witness thereof, this present decree has been signed and sealed by the hand and seal of the very Reverend Monsignor, the Cardinal of Santa Cecilia, the Bishop of Albano. Okay? So this is where science stops dead on its tracks, but as we know, it did not work. Now we're going to go back into Prague. There was a great rabbi in Prague. He was the Kabbalist, one of the great, not the, but one of the greatest Kabbalists of the 16th century in the Kabbalistic revolution. And his name was the Maharal of Prague. The Maharal of Prague, not only when he heard about Copernicus in the work of Tycho Brahe, he believed, and you'll see why, that not only such work is acceptable, it is a mitzvah, it's incumbent upon us to participate in that research. Because he did believe that the world has two books, the book of nature and the book of the Torah. And all of them inform of each other. They're representations of the same idea. And the last thing anybody can do and should do is to take the Bible literally. We were given the oral Torah to explain what the Bible is talking about. So says the Maharal, the foundational idea. And he says what it says in the Bible about natural truths. It's not natural phenomenon. The Torah is not doing that. The Torah rely on science for that. It's telling you what's called the ontological essence of things. When you talk about the earth being static, doesn't mean that the physical earth is static. The Bible doesn't relate to that. The Bible relates to the ontological essence and truth. That the spiritual essence of the earth is that. And therefore, you have to understand the physical phenomena to understand how it relates to the spiritual ontological truth. But you have to explore scientific phenomena. And he says, I heard, he writes at that time, I have the original book that he writes this in the 16th century. I heard that there is somebody in Poland called Copernicus who has found a great idea that the earth is not static, that revolves around the sun. And I believe that Kabbalistically that's true. We have to go and explore that. Do you know what he did at that time? He sent a student of his to spend time at the observatory. His name was Rabbi David Gans. And he wrote a book on that. It's the first ever religious book to not only consider Copernicus, but to discuss Copernicus' theory at length. And he spent time, he never met Copernicus, right? He was way afterwards. He spent time with Tycho Brahe and Johann Kepler. And with those two, he spent time with them, and he describes his experience at the observatory. And people, you have a copy here. It is one of the most fascinating diaries of somebody who spent time learning the system of Copernicus. At the time when the Church was afraid, didn't want to touch and ban the books, the Maharal not only believed that it is acceptable, he thought that you have to explore. Life with the physical phenomenon of the world is the imprint of God, and you have to learn it the same way you learn the Bible. And then you have to understand how the two relate to each other. But you can't force upon reality. Reality is one thing, the essence is different, and they talk to each other. And that's what the Maharal does. Now, if you want to see, this is, the next page is the book. You know what it's called, the book, the name of the book in Hebrew is called Nechmad Venaim. It's dear and is enjoyable. Because the theory is dear and is enjoyable to learn. And he goes to describe in great detail, okay? Let me just see if I can read to you in Hebrew. This, I think it's the next page. Yes, next page. Nicolaus Copernicus. Take a look what he says. This is the introduction to the book. And he writes like this, Nicolaus Copernicus. This is not regular Hebrew script. It's called Rashi script. Does anybody know what Rashi script is? Commentaries were written in a different Hebrew. The letters were a little different, but the same idea. So he says like this, Nicolaus Copernicus, Nikolai Copernicus, Ish Prussia, he is from Prussia. Chacham Gadol Umuflag B'Chomat Huna, he's a great sage and a great genius in astronomy. Al Kol Anshei Doroz Mano, and he's greater than any other astronomer at that time. This is the book that the church banned completely. So here, the attitude of the rabbis. Gam Chachmei Zmaneinu Kulam Kechad, all of the sages of our time, all the scientists, everybody agrees how smart and how deep he was. And they say, that's what he's writing, this rabbi, about Copernicus, that Mimot Baltimus, from the time of Ptolemy, Lo Nimtza Kamo Aish Hazeh B'Daruch, that there's nobody who has come from the 2nd century, from Ptolemy to Copernicus, there was no greater astronomer. And he says, I'm going to spend time with him to understand what did he come up with. And then he writes, he goes ahead, and he wasn't such a great artist, but he decided to go ahead and to show to his Jewish audience, what is the name of this? Everybody should remember, the sextant. The sextant that you saw in the pictures in, anybody who saw the physical one in Prague, but you could see the one here, this is what he describes. And he tells you how the measurements are made. And, okay. So this is the Maharal, the beginning of the scientific revolution. And the Maharal says, if you want to know the essence of the world, the Bible is the greatest companion to the book of nature. Because the Bible tells you the ontological essence of things. Nature tells you how it functions. And putting the two together, you could understand the book of God. And that's the whole work of the Kabbalist, is to bring the two together. So if you go back, now we're going to go back just to read what the Maharal writes about Copernicus. The Maharal himself, not the Maharal himself, but the translation, if you want to know, 1612. So you realize that book that we just read is 1612, the ban of the church is 1616 at the same time. So you look at the attitude of the church and the attitude of the rabbis, and you see the difference between the two. And if you want, just the pages before, I'm not going, sorry. You should read the Jewish opinion. I just told you 70 years ago, there lived a man named Copernicus, and you have the whole translation. The one who did is a great scholar. That was his dissertation showing the difference between the two. Now, how does the world evolve? You realize the scientific revolution, the church could not hold scientific development into place. But there was a greater problem with the church doctrine. I just told you, they went ahead and they see the discoveries are challenging their beliefs. So what is the first attitude they have? Oh, that's it, ban the books, just put it on the rug, nobody find out, forget it, we continue the Bible. That doesn't work. But there was a more fundamental issue. And we are going to see, I'm trying to give you a little picture. We are going to go now to the end of the scientific revolution and to see the Jewish attitude and the Jewish impact on the end of the scientific revolution. Who is the end of the scientific revolution? Newton. And who was the competitor of Newton that nobody knows who got there first? Calculus, the inventor of calculus. Huh? In Leibniz. We're going to see there, and people are going to see something fascinating. You realize, why did the world stay static from the 2nd century to the 16th century? There was no scientific development. Why not? It's called the Dark Ages. Why was it Dark Ages? What was the issue that stopped people on their tracks? You know what the issue was? Was the Catholic dogma. And you'll see how this changed and what changed. Does anybody know how medicine, we just now are in astronomy. We're going to move into the second part because the scientific revolution is not only astronomy, it's medicine also. What was the medicine practiced for 1,200 years, from 2nd century to the 16th century? What was the great book of medicine? Yes?
I don't know what the book is. What was the practice, though?
Yes.
They used the bloodletting.
Right, but why? What was the fundamental? What's based upon? You're right.
Disease out of your body.
Right. Great. Excellent. Excellent. Good. But there was a book that dictated. That was the book that was Hippocrates, right? But that's not. Hippocrates came to explain something. He came to explain, Hippocrates is the original Greek, and it was explained later by the book that was used for 1,200 years. It's called Galen. Everybody heard about Galen medicine? Galen, Galen medicine. And Galen medicine, what's your name again? What Matt said is exactly true, but I'll tell you the fundamental idea. His idea was, God is perfect, right? That we assume. Okay, we don't know him, but we assume he's perfect. The Bible says so. Adam went ahead and he messed up the world by the original sin. That's why Jesus Christ came to save the world, and the only way to save the world is by the form of grace, right? That's a basic theory. Basic theory is God creates the world perfect. The world is perfect. Great. Garden of Eden. Comes the Satan, forces man, and man screws it up. And what does he do? He destroys the world, the original sin, and it's hopeless. Humanity is hopeless. And the only way humanity gets saved is by God sending his own son to die on the cross with grace. Okay? So medicine follows the same idea. The body is perfect. Do you know how you get sick? That something comes into your body, you have to let it out. Or if there is an imbalance in the body. He assumed the body had 4 humors. He's very humorous what he says, but he said the 4 humors. There is the hot, the cold, and then there is the bile and something else. But he says, when do you get a cold? When the cold humor is stronger, so you're out of balance. So if you have a cold, how do you combat your cold? You have to strengthen the warm humor, which means you drink hot soup, or you go ahead and you stay in bed with lots of blankets, and you bring it up. There's too much blood in the system, so blood is the third, is blood and bile. If blood is too much, you let blood out. So it's not all because the disease is out, because you have too much blood in your system. The disease is caused by the imbalance of the 4. Because the world is perfect. If there is a sickness, it's because we have imperfection. The best way to do, look at how the world is. You know how perfection is achieved? By going backwards. And you know what science is? Contemplative. You know what's contemplative science? You have to understand how the universe works to understand what the balance is. And all of your work is to bring back to the pristine original state. But you know what was the problem with this? It works very nicely, but there is one thing that makes it not work. It's called the bacteria. Bacteria, you could drink as much hot and cold soup and let your blood out, whatever you do, with bacteria and an infection, you will die if you don't have antibiotics. So that's why the leverage people, if you look at the lifespan in that period, it was like 35 years old, besides the babies, that died so many babies. But you got the first infection, Galen didn't work. Until somebody wanted to say, you know something, perhaps we have to create something to destroy the bacteria, to take an active attitude. Who was the person who invented chemistry? Who is the father of chemistry? I'm sorry, Paracelsus. You should remember those things, guys. We have to know. We live in a world that we got to know how we got here. Meaning it's very nice to live in a world and to open your television and to think that God created us with a television, but that was not so. Okay? So we have to see how the world got here, and hopefully that's what you're going to get. Paracelsus was the father of chemistry, and he realized that Galen is again BS. It doesn't work. The world is not perfect. There are imperfections that you have to go and take care of it. You have to take a positive, active attitude to change it. And this person was Paracelsus. But this violated church dogma because the world is perfect. What, you are going to make the world better? Man can only make it worse. So that created a great challenge to the world. Science was supposed to be passive. You know what Aristotle did? He dreamed about science, not ever making one experiment. There were no laboratories. Because you could understand, since you're going back to the original world that's not here anymore, so you just have to imagine the original world and try to get there. Science, people realize it's not. We need to take an active attitude. But the church dogma made that as if you're challenging God. You know what allowed Paracelsus to function, and then Leibniz, and then Newton? And I'll show you, this is a famous person who wrote his dissertation. Her name is Alison Couder, and this is very famous because she uncovered all the letters, is one event that allowed science to move forward, and that's the closing of the scientific revolution, because science became accepted. Does anybody know what is that pivotal event? The Kuhnian, Thomas Kuhn. Then people realized, wow, you know something? We got it. What was that pivotal event? Can anybody just guess? There's one event that you can point because Leibniz, the nice part of these guys is that's not so long ago, so they kept detailed letters about what they thought. So it's very easy to go through the letters, just have to know language. And we found Newton's writings. Newton's writings were amazing. And he wrote a lot more in this kind of stuff that I'm going to talk to you, much more than he wrote on science, and that informed and allowed him to be a free thinker, and that changed the world. And from then on, that's it, the end of the revolution. There was one pivotal event. Anybody? Not the crisis of 2008, nothing to do with that, it was way early before that, was the translation of Lurianic Kabbalah into Latin. And you'll see, there was a great Kabbalist. I just told you one of the Kabbalists that we just spoke is the Maharal. There was a second great Kabbalist that lived in Safed, and he revolutionized the world of thought in Jewish thought. And his writings revolutionized the world. You know how old was he when he died? He was approximately 36, maybe 32. His writings are his thoughts and teachings for 18 months. The 18 months of teachings were compiled, and he was called by an acronym, and his acronym is the ARI. The ARI is the acronym for Eloki Rabbi Yitzchak, the godly Rabbi Isaac. And he was the one who revolutionized Jewish thought. And his writings were in Hebrew. It was not written by him, were mediated by his great disciple, Rabbi Chaim Vital. And that book was translated into Latin. And its Latin translation was called Kabbalah Denudata. Kabbalah Denudata means Kabbalah undressed. And that book revolutionized the world that we know, and that book is credited by most scholars to the validation of scientific revolution, and that becomes the credo of all scientists. And I'll show you. So you have copies. So I have the original book at home. The book is very, very thick. And it looks like those old ancient books. And this revolutionized because it's Kabbalah in Latin. So I'll show you what it is. Sorry. Am I moving forward? Okay. The impact, this is, people, a great book. It's a very, very expensive book. If anybody wants, I'll be able to send you excerpts of the book. But this book it's a book published by Brill, one of the top academic presses, by somebody called Alison Couder. And she wrote The Impact of Kabbalah in the 17th Century, the life and thought of Francis Mercure von Helmont. Von Helmont was one of the great grandchildren of Paracelsus. And he realized what Paracelsus was going through. He realized that medicine is not bringing back the pre-state, meaning we can't have a world that you're going back. You have to change direction and go forward. The concept is now we're not digressing, we are progressing. So he was a patron, he got a publisher, he became a publisher, and he decided to publish the translation of Kabbalah into Latin. And the one who did it, his name was Christian Knorr. Christian Knorr is the translator. By the way, today, all the correspondence of the people who corresponded with Van Helmont, including Leibniz, all of that correspondence is in the library in Hanover. So you could read how that book changed. And if you look at it for a second, these are the drawings of the Kabbalistic work in Kabbalah Denudata. And you see why this had such a huge impact. But this is the Kabbalistic language of the universe. And if you want to see something, this is the famous frontispiece of Kabbalah Denudata. This is, if you look in Latin it says this is the gate of the secrets. And below her feet, it's progress and movement. And you see, this is wisdom that's taking Kabbalah and going forwards instead of going backwards. Because that's what Kabbalah tells you. The Lurianic Kabbalah tells you the universe is moving forward, it doesn't move backwards. And that changed the whole world. And this is the gate of secrets, and this Kabbalah Denudata has the impact of changing thought at the end, and this what validated Newton. Newton writes at length about it. He changed political philosophy. Who is political for John Locke? John Locke corresponded to von Helmont on this book. This changed Leibniz. Leibniz, I told you, and it's interesting, if you will go through the book, if anybody wants a copy of it, you could see the actual correspondence, how they're looking and reading it and say, listen, the world has changed. Now, what did the book do that was so unbelievable? You know what the Arizal says? When God created the world, he created the world imperfect. He created the world lacking perfection, and the world is built out of balance. And humans have something called the tikkun. Does anybody know what the tikkun is? And that word tikkun changes the world. You know the word tikkun means? We are here to better and to fix the problem that God made. God wanted to give a role to the human, to the universe. We are called by God the partners in creation. Because God created the world with a defect. And that defect needs to be repaired. That defect is called the Shvirata Kelim, that the world, the universe was broken. And there was a defect in the process. And we as humans are there with the obligation and the mandate and the power to rectify it, to fix it. It's called the tikkun. And that tikkun is the greatness and the awesomeness and the mandate and the mission of the humans in this planet. So we are here not to contemplate the universe, says Dari. We are here to make the universe better. Because if you leave the universe on its own, it's not like Galen that the universe is perfect. We all die in the first infection and bacteria that comes up. Because that's the defect of creation. When God created Adam, he said, let us build man. The us is who? God was talking to man himself. I'm creating you as my partner. We are going to make the world better. It raised the role of man. And it said the world is teleological. The world moves forward. Messiah will only come when the tikkun will come to its culmination. That's why Dari says that one of the greatest signs of the coming of the Messiah is when evolution, but not only creativity, innovation, scientific development will speed up very quickly because the world will be rushing towards its final tikkun. And that's the role of man. Paracelsus was not trying to criticize God. He was a partner of God. And that is the ethos. And that Leibniz and Newton says, you know something, what we're doing? We are with a divine mission. And that changed the perspective of the world. So Leibniz, Newton, Locke changed, and Kabbalah becomes the lingua franca of science. And that is the scientific development approach and ethos that is completely Jewish. And if you look at anybody else, you know that scientific revolution starts with that initiative and the attitude of the Maral, that's in the Jewish response to it, and also a total Jewish response, at the same time how the church responded differently. And it impacted science on its own at the end, and that brings the end of revolution, not the revolution, becomes normal, by the publication of Kabbalah Denudata and its dissemination among the learned people of Europe. And that's the end of the first stage in science. So you should know something, the Kabbalah and the attitude is the real companion to understanding the universe. And I hope that you go ahead and remember, and if you have any questions. Now, so I told you, this is the talk of today. We are going to go ahead, I told you, this is the first stage. We are going to see the next stage is Darwin, how he comes into the Enlightenment, and how the Enlightenment develops science into the next stage, which is not scientific revolution, early modern, but it's something called modern science, which is from Newton up to quantum, and then we're going to see the next time how quantum and the postmodernist theories relate. Now, we're going to open for questions. If anybody has any questions, comments, criticism, please, it's your turn. Yes, Matt.
Why were the Jews so enlightened and why were the Christians so closed-minded?
The Jewish attitude, you see, it's a question of the human mission, the human role in the universe. One of the greatest, and I'll tell you something very interesting that you show again, my thoughts. There is, and I thrive, what I spend a lot of time is something called comparative religion. Comparing different languages of religion because it's fascinating. I think religion is a great, for me, it's something very, very important. I think it's also very foundational to the developed man. But consciously or subconsciously, that's what it does. There is a very big difference. The major difference, the Talmud says, when Christianity comes into place, the early Christianity, what was the crux of the fight? Okay, where was the contention? In other words, the fact that Jewish was a Messiah, because Jesus did not come out as a God to start with. He was a Messiah. The question is, why was he so banned and not accepted? What was the dynamics of the Christian ethos and the Jewish ethos? You know what it is on? In the concept of the oral Torah. The oral Torah is the issue. The Christians believed we have only scripture given by God. And therefore man is doomed to fail. That's the whole idea of God, of the Son of God dying at the cross, is the concept of grace. That we on our own are doomed to fail. And the only hope for humanity is get grace. You know what grace is? You get something for nothing. The Son of God dies on the cross to be, as you know, the scapegoat for humanity. Vicarious. He dies and he functions vicariously. Does anybody know what the word vicariously mean? What does vicariously mean? On somebody else's behalf. We do nothing and God dies for us. That is great. We don't believe in vicarious. We believe in the oral Torah, human intervention, human action. We are here not doomed to fail. Failure is part of life. We are here to on our own. We don't want anything vicariously. We believe, in Jewish belief, there's such a thing called the bread of shame. You know what the bread of shame means? That God could give us everything for nothing. He doesn't need us to come here. Why did he bother sending us to the world, allowing us to fail and giving us a second chance? What's the purpose of this? God is great. Grace, why does he need to kill his own son for grace? Let him already not even try. But the idea is we want to be imitate Dei. We want to imitate God. To imitate God, the basic function of God that we know is that God is independent, right? Because God is one. He can't depend on anybody else because there's nobody else besides him. So we have to emulate him. The emulation is that at least we have to depend on our own time. We have to ourselves deserve. Desert is basic to us. Grace is the worst kind of a relationship. You know what is Jewish hell? Jewish hell is not to be burned. In other words, Dante's Inferno has nothing to do with the Jewish approach. That is the damnation. We don't believe. You know what is eternal damnation in Jewish thought? Is getting something for nothing. In the end, all of us are going to participate in the world to come. But the ones of us who did and participate in the work, we are going to do it out of our own desert. We are deserving. Otherwise, we are going to get something for nothing. So therefore, the human role is different. Christian role of humans is completely different. That's the whole idea of Christian theology. We believe in the oral Torah. What's the oral Torah? That humans learn and study, and they ask questions, and they come with answers, and they develop. This is Jewish life. Rabbinic thought, if you realize there was a contention at the time of the destruction of the temple way before. You know what the rabbis locate Jesus? Very interesting, the Talmud. When did Jesus leave, the Jesus of Nazareth? When did he die, and how do we know that? He died around the year 30 of the Common Era. The way how we know it, besides the fact that the Gospels allude to it, but the Gospels, as you know, to read the Gospels, there are 4 Gospels, the Synoptics, and that we have to read it, and there are all kinds of criteria, dissimilarity, dependent attestations, whatever. But what we know is there is one place only, okay, that says that Jesus actually existed. It is an indirect allusion. It's Tacitus. Tacitus is the great historian of Rome. What book did he write, Tacitus? He wrote the Annals of Rome, the story, the history of Rome. And he says that there are Christians who believed in Jesus of Nazareth who died by Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate was the proctor of Rome, of Jerusalem, of Alina Capitolina, when? In the year 30 of the Common Era. The rabbis say that, no, you know when did Jesus appear? In the time of the Maccabees, in Hanukkah. In the times of the Maccabees, in Hanukkah. In the generation, the 50 years after Hanukkah, when Maccabees was written. And everybody says, wow, one second, the Talmud was not written at the same time, but how is the Jewish chronology so different than the Christian chronology? It's not only Christian, only Tacitus of Rome says that he lived in the year 30. But the answer is because the rabbis never tell you the chronological history. They're telling you what's called paradigmatic history. They're telling you essential ideas. They believe that Jesus of Nazareth, Christianity, is born by the time of the Maccabees. Because at the time of the Maccabees, they rebelled against the Greeks. Greeks were science. They rebelled against the Greeks. So Jesus takes that as an idea that, you know, something, human development is bad, is no good. And that was the idea of Jesus of Nazareth, the rabbi said, was born in Hanukkah. They misread the whole idea of they misread the whole idea of the Jewish rebellion. You know what's amazing? I'm going to tell you things for Hanukkah. We are Hanukkah, we used to know something interesting. There was a book written by the generation after Maccabees. Maccabees happened in the year of the 2nd century BCE. There was a book written that was within 50 years called the 2nd generation's Maccabeans. What book is it? It's called Maccabees 1. Did anybody ever read Maccabees 1? Maccabees 1 is very funny. You know why? We only have a Greek copy, no Hebrew. But we all know that the book was originally written in Hebrew and was translated into Greek, into Koine Greek. Today, if you look at the historical, what's called the scholarly editions, they're taking the Greek back into Hebrew. That's very funny, right? The Hebrew, but the Hebrew was lost. You know why? Because the rabbi said, this is the misreading of the story of Hanukkah. And this book doesn't belong to us. You know who adopted Maccabees into their canon? The Christians. You know, the Christian Bible and the Jewish Bible are the same. We have, how many books do we have in the Bible? The Tanakh? Please guess. No, that's a Pentateuch. Pentateuch is the books of Moses, there are 5. But how many is the Tanakh, which is the holy written scriptures? There are 24 books. The Christians have many more books in the Old Testament. Two of them is called Maccabees 1 and Maccabees 2. So why did they take Maccabees? Why did the rabbis take out the Maccabees and they accepted Maccabees? What's wrong with Maccabees? And the rabbi said that Maccabees probably, that's how I read it, is what Christianity starts from. You know what's missing in Maccabees? The story of the light of the candles. We light candles in Hanukkah, and we say, what's the story? We know Hanukkah was a rebellion against the Greeks, but what did we do? The priest, the high priest, wanted to find oil. There was no oil. Remember, there was not oil enough. He found oil for 1 day, and it took 8 days to manufacture oil. And he lights the candle, and miraculously, that little candle, instead of lighting for 1 day, light for 8 days. That's why I light the candles of Hanukkah. Maccabees doesn't have that story. And the rabbi said, the book doesn't mean anything because they're missing that story. Why? Why is that story so important? And why did they take it out? See, the Christians take Maccabees. That's our history. I told you, it's not even kept in Hebrew because we discarded it. And the Christians adopted it, and today we have it because it's translated from the Christian Greek back into Hebrew. And we took it. What's wrong? Why did we love Maccabees so much? We despise Maccabees so much and they loved it so much? Because of the story of the oil that's missing. Who cares about the story of the oil? But people, you understand, the story of the oil represents Hanukkah. They looked at Hanukkah as a rebellion against civilization. They went, and Maccabee says we have to be ascetic, and you have to be monastic and get out of the world, all the stories of that. We said that's not what the rebellion is all about. The rebellion is to bring light. It's not to bring darkness. It's the lesson is to bring light. And look at the miracle of the candles. You know, the miracle of the candles. How much oil did they find? They found enough oil for how many nights? For 1 night. How many nights did they light for? 8. So the Beit Yosef, a great rabbi of the 16th century, was asked, how many days was the miracle? If it was enough for 1 night, how many nights was the miracle for? 7. So why don't we light for 7 nights? Why do we light for 8? The first night, there was enough oil. So the Beit Yosef, he said, you know why? Because when the rabbi saw there was no oil on the high priest, he didn't despair. He took the oil and he divided it into 8 little parts, and every day he lit with less oil than the normal. A little bit less oil. And God made the little oil that was enough for 1/8 of the night to last for the entire night. You know what the lesson is? The lesson is the humans, we have to do our part. If the priest could have said, no, sir, there's enough for 1 night to light for 1 night, and the rest of it, that's it. Let God bring out of grace oil of heaven. That doesn't happen. It's always a partnership. We light a little bit, and God does the rest. That's the message of Hanukkah. So we reread Hanukkah. So this idea is the Jesus of Nazareth. So God, the rabbis tell you, know the idea of Jesus of Nazareth, of the idea of grace. It's not Pontius Pilate. That's in the 40 of the Common Era. This started 200 years before. It just manifested itself later. But the apocalyptic Jews, the idea that the world has no, hope, this hopeless, this whole idea of grace, happened in year 40, but started in the 200. That's the Hanukkah. Hanukkah, we light candles. Ironically enough, Hanukkah always falls around Christmas. So you always think, like, very nice. But you realize, that's it. This is the crux of the game. The crux of the game, you have a choice between Christmas and Hanukkah. And that is the same time. That's the battle. The battle is the world doomed to fail, or is the world bringing light? What's the role of the humans? What the war against the Greeks meant? Hellenism. Does it mean that we wanted to go in a cocoon and go into the desert like Maccabee says? No, that's not the idea. The idea is that we believe that human innovation is a partnership with God. That's the idea of the candles. That each one, we lit a little bit of our own light and God made it work. That's the beauty of Hanukkah. So that's idea. So going back, this idea that we saw in this struggle in scientific development is in the cradle of the beginning of Christianity and its fight against Judaism. And that is Hanukkah. So when you go and light Hanukkah next week, you have to realize, some people have Hanukkah and a Christmas tree. And they don't realize that those are mutually exclusive, right? Because if you have the Christmas tree, you could have Hanukkah, but the Christians believe in Hanukkah, but they don't believe in the candles of Hanukkah. You look at Maccabees, it doesn't say anywhere about the candles, because that violates their philosophy and their theology. So if you have a Christmas tree and candles of Hanukkah, you are basically lost. You're very confused because they're mutually exclusive. And that became true in Galileo Galilei, and that was freed. The world freed itself of that very heavy theology by the impact of Kabbalah, when Kabbalah became translated into Latin. So it allowed a new perspective in the world, which is the return to the original rabbinical idea of Hanukkah and the candles and the light. By the way, Hanukkah and the light of the candles is probably the greatest Kabbalistic holiday of the year. The greatest Kabbalist. Meaning the amount of Kabbalistic works written by the candles of Hanukkah are great, because I told you that Kabbalistic idea of the partnership of man of Tikkun is the concept of the candles. Okay, I'm sorry, a long answer to a short question. Okay, anybody else? Yes, what's your name?
Lori.
Lori, hi.
What did you say that the idea that we were already, that the world was created imperfectly, that it wasn't just the whole the sin in the garden? You said it was called Shmirat what?
Shvirat HaKelim. Shvirat HaKelim is the breaking, the shattering of the vessels. It's called, the world in its form is called the world of Tohu, the world of confusion, the world of chaos. And Adam came here to bring the world of chaos, of confusion, which is a function of the shattering of the vessels, to bring it to the world of Tikkun, which is the final culmination, the final fixing, and the final structure, the ultimate structure. It's called Shvirat HaKelim. Shvirat, the breaking of Kelim. Kelim are the vessels. Is the shattering of the vessels. Yes? Right? Okay. Okay, so we'll close. If anybody wants to ask questions, etc.
Jewish hell, I missed what you said, so
What?
Jewish hell.
Jewish hell is participating in heaven without deserving. The world without deserving. The world without desert. The world of grace. You really realize something. The world, the heaven, the Christian heaven is the Jewish hell. Okay? In other words, Dante's hell, which is the inferno and the limbo and all that stuff, is nothing Jewish. The Jewish, if you want to know what is Jewish hell and Jewish damnation, is Christian heaven, which means the world of grace, undeserving, to participate in God's creation and to realize that you don't belong, the lack of belonging. That's hell.
And the rules for participation?
The rules of participation is the Torah that God gave to us. That is the role of Tikkun, that we are here to make it better and to participate and to be God's partners. Have a good night, have a happy Hanukkah, and remember, light the candles. Okay.